The guards raised the alarm late at night. A single candle was burning in the monastery library, and the guard sent to check why the light was on looked inside and froze. A young monk was standing at the table. Next to him was a copyist's apprentice, the son of the town apothecary. The monk was pressing the young man against a bookcase and kissing him. The guard recoiled and nearly dropped his torch. He did not enter or shout, but quietly retreated to the door and quickened his pace to the guardhouse. Halfway down the corridor, he bumped into the prince, who was returning from dinner with the abbot. The prince noticed his confused expression, paused, moved forward, and, without waiting for an explanation, opened the library door himself. The monk and the young man recoiled, the candle swayed, and the coverless binding fell onto the table. The prince watched in silence. Then he ordered the guard to leave and close the door. He remained alone in the library, picked up the book, opened it, smoothed out the pages, extinguished the candle, and left. In the morning, he told his father everything. The king listened to the brief story without details, crossed his arms over his chest, and told his son to be silent. He explained that the monastery was a pillar of power, that the abbot ran a school for future officials and clerks, and that merchants who lent money to the palace were connected to the monastery. He said that one incident should not destroy peace and order. He added that monks are human beings, and weakness happens among them, but such things are hushed up and buried without fuss. The prince replied that he could not participate in this silence because he considered lies to be a contagion that corrodes everything else. He said that he had seen it himself and was not going to pretend that nothing had happened. The king repeated his order. The prince obeyed outwardly, but that evening he sent a letter to the city judge in which he described what he had seen and asked for an investigation. The judge went to the palace, not to the king, but to the chancellor. The three of them had a conversation. The king again ordered the case to be closed. The judge cautiously objected. A letter from the heir to the throne could not be ignored. Rumors were already spreading, and the guards were talking among themselves. The chancellor proposed a compromise: to hold a closed investigation without a protocol, to leave a general conclusion on paper about compliance with the charter, and not to mention any names. The prince refused. He said that if the names were removed, it would be just another piece of empty paper. He wanted the monastery to be dealt with fairly, the guilty to be punished, and the young man to be left alone. The king became angry and sent the chancellor and the judge away. Then he called his son to him, closed the doors, and reminded him that the state was based not only on truth, but also on silence. The prince stood straight, silent, and when his father finished speaking, he asked permission to leave and prepare his own statement to the townspeople. The next day, the prince posted a short letter at the palace gate. In it, he wrote that he had witnessed a violation of the charter during the night and asked the abbot of the monastery to conduct a public investigation so that young students could see that the law is the same for everyone. The letter was read by apprentices, merchants, and soldiers. Soon, the abbot arrived at the gate with 2 monks and asked for the letter to be removed. The prince refused. The abbot turned pale but kept his voice steady and said that the prince did not understand the structure of monastic life and was harming the cause that protected his own power. In the evening, soldiers of the palace guard tore down the letter on the king's orders. The prince wrote another one and attached it to the doors of the town hall. The townspeople argued and discussed. Someone at the market said that the prince was angry with the monastery because of an old quarrel. Someone replied that, on the contrary, he was honest and did not tolerate flattery. Someone remarked that the young man from the copyist's workshop was now in trouble. 3 days later, the young man disappeared. His father, a pharmacist, came to the town hall and asked about him. The copyist said that the boy had left in the evening on an errand from the abbot and had not returned. The guard shrugged. The city judge pretended to be involved in the search, but asked no one anything. The prince went to the monastery himself and demanded a meeting with the abbot. The abbot received him in his cell, in the middle of which stood a table for working with manuscripts, as clean as a surgeon's. The abbot spoke calmly, as if they were discussing the purchase of parchment. He reported that an investigation had been conducted, no violations of the charter had been found, and that talk of this was harmful and must cease. The prince asked to be told where the young man was. The abbot replied that he did not know. The prince realized that the young man was either being hidden or had been secretly sent away. He returned to the palace and tried to get an audience with his father. The king did not receive him. At night, without warning the guards, the prince went to the apothecary's house. The windows were open, and the wife was washing jugs in the kitchen. The apothecary sat down opposite the prince and placed a bag of silver on the table. He said that 3 days ago, people from the monastery had come to him and told him not to make a fuss, but to accept compensation instead. He added that he was afraid of bad luck in business, afraid of the shop being closed and the scales being inspected, afraid of the excise taxes being recalculated. The prince asked for the silver back and to appeal to the judge again. The apothecary refused. He said that he still had younger children and that he and his wife had decided to move to relatives in a border town. He was going to sell the shop. The prince returned to the palace in a rage, but his anger was helpless. He asked the captain of the guard where the librarian monk was. The captain replied that the monk had been transferred to another section of the monastery for penance, but did not specify the location. The next morning, the king convened a council. At the council, he announced that for the sake of peace in the city and tranquility among the merchants, the heir to the throne would be sent abroad to study. There he would master jurisprudence and financial management and return as a mature ruler. The prince understood the purpose of the decision but did not argue. The court listened to the speech without objection. The chancellor, answering questions, spoke of the tradition of sending heirs on journeys. The prince left a week later. He was seen off without ceremony. On the day of his departure, he went to the monastery church alone and stood in the back row. The abbot looked up during the service, saw him, and looked away. After the service, the prince walked around the library walls and stopped at the window from which the guard had left that night. He said nothing, turned, and walked to the gate. Life in exile was simple and austere. He did indeed enroll in school, sat in classrooms, listened to teachers, and took notes. He lived modestly, without attendance, on a small pension that was regularly transferred from the treasury. In his spare time, he went to court and listened to cases. He was accustomed to looking not at slogans and loud words, but at the consistency of actions. He noted how jurors avoided direct conclusions, how judges politely hid sharp corners in their wording, how thick books helped to close their eyes. He understood that truth was worth little without will and without a willingness to bear the consequences. Sometimes in the evening he remembered the library and the young man. He did not imagine a face, but an empty place at the table and unfinished lines in a thick book. He returned to these thoughts not out of pity, but to maintain a straightforwardness that did not depend on his position. One day, a carriage bearing the coat of arms of his native kingdom arrived in the city where he lived. The prince thought he was being called back, but he was mistaken. It was not his father's messenger who had come for him, but a gray carriage belonging to the monastery service. In the carriage sat the very monk from the library. He had been brought under escort. He looked older, with sunken eyes, but his eyes were attentive. The prince met the carriage in the courtyard of the inn. Two men led the monk out, placed him against the wall, and left him there. Three people from the monastery handed the prince a sealed letter. The letter was not from the king, but from the abbot. It said that the monk, who had violated the charter many years ago, was causing temptation and turmoil. He must be removed from the monastery and placed in a house of repentance in a foreign land, and the heir to the throne, as an educated man free from party interests, was entrusted with overseeing the execution. The tone of the letter was friendly, almost courteous. It seemed to suggest establishing a friendly silence in place of the long-standing conflict. The prince settled the monk in a cheap room at the city hospital and arranged for a doctor to examine him. The doctor said that the monk was emaciated and had suffered from fever. The prince bought him simple clothes without any signs of his order. They hardly spoke during the first few weeks. The prince watched. The monk got up early, sat by the window, looked at the street, and sometimes read. He demanded nothing, asked for nothing, made no excuses, and accused no one. He ate little. He seemed to be relearning how to walk around the city without the rules of the monastery bell. The prince brought him food and books. In a book on monastery law, the monk left a subtle note in the margins: "The internal charter is always stronger than external law." The note was neat, without provocation. The prince did not argue. He remembered that night in the library and understood that the text was not the issue here. Rumors about the monk quickly spread throughout the neighborhoods. Many believed that the prince was harboring a transgressor. Others whispered that he was preparing a new attack on the abbot. Still others shrugged and said that it was a private matter for a man with a conscience. The prince stayed out of the conversation. He accompanied the monk to the hospital, arranged for medication, and paid for his stay for 6 months in advance. Sometimes he came at night and sat on a chair by the bed while the monk slept. He closed the windows and adjusted the blanket. He did not think about pity. He thought about the chain of events that had led to today: the nighttime meeting, the letter at the gate, the missing young man, the departure, the years of study, the carriage with the coat of arms. He tried to understand where the exit was in this chain, but could not find it anywhere. Everything fell into a straight line. A year passed. The monk grew stronger. He began to go out on his own, sometimes lingering at the bookbinder's bench, sorting through scraps of leather, stroking the embossing on the spines of other people's books. He did not ask about the young man's fate. The prince did not ask either. But one day, a man from the former copy workshop arrived in town. no longer an apprentice, but a journeyman assigned to make purchases. He recognized the monk, but pretended to see him for the first time. He greeted the prince, read the direct expectation in his gaze, and lowered his eyes. Then they met again, and a third time. The fourth time, the assistant said just enough. The young man was taken away that same night to the sea, put on a ship, and sent to a colony where cheap labor was needed. The abbot's people took care of him, not the city court. He did not die on the way, but disappeared from the colony's records, where the bosses changed and the lists were rewritten. It was impossible to know whether he was alive or not. The prince listened and said nothing. He dismissed the idea of searching. He realized that now any paper could be forged and any name could be erased from the list. 2 years later, the king died. The news came late, but it came for sure. The chancellor sent a stern note: "Return to the capital and take your place at the throne as heir." The prince quickly gathered his things. He went to the hospital to see the monk and said it was time to go. The monk nodded. They set off together, without an entourage or insignia. On the way, the prince thought not about the coronation, but about how the first meeting of the council would go and who would raise their eyes at the word monastery. He repeated the sequence of steps to himself, as if preparing for a court hearing: the facts, the witnesses, the missing young man, the abbot's letter, the cart, the year in the hospital, the legend of repentance. They saw the capital early in the morning. The city was the same in layout, but different in the subtlety of its gestures. The market was noisy. The guards at the gates were watching more closely. People stood in front of the palace to see the face of the heir. The prince entered the courtyard without delay. There were no posters hanging at the monastery gate as they passed by. The library now had new window frames and iron plates screwed onto the doors. The abbot was the same, only his hair had turned gray. The council was scheduled for the next day. Before the meeting, the prince sent for the abbot and asked him to bring documents on transfers and punishments for the last 10 years. The abbot sent a letter refusing. He referred to the internal charter. The prince did not insist in writing. He ordered the guards with the council seal to go to the monastery and escort the abbot and the treasurer. The guards returned alone, saying that the gates were closed and the brethren had formed a wall, and through the window they were handed a bag of letters from influential merchants and relatives, asking them not to take any drastic steps. The prince listened and postponed the meeting for 2 hours. During this time, he sent for the city judge and chancellor. The judge explained that the law was on the monastery side. The charter was recognized by the ruling houses, and interference was traditionally limited. The chancellor habitually advised against breaking the tabletop with his fist. At the appointed hour, the prince opened the session. He spoke without embellishment. He described how everything had been 10 years ago, named the library, named the night guard, named the missing young man. He said that he had returned not for revenge, but to put an end to the hidden decay in which the city and the monastery were living. He brought the monk out and placed him before the council. The faces in the hall moved cautiously, as if in the heat. The prince proposed a simple procedure: to examine the case, establish the facts, open the books, assign responsibility, and appoint measures that would not be reprisals, but would not be empty words either. He added that there were many people living in the monastery who did useful work and should not be confused with those who used the charter as a shield. He spoke of a chain of events, not of morality. He asked for agreement to open the archives. The chancellor raised his hand to suggest that the matter be considered by committees. Several councillors nodded. The gallery was silent. The prince realized that everything would now be drowned out again in polite maneuvering. He closed his eyes and for a second imagined the scribe's empty table, the one on which the book had fallen that night. Then he opened his eyes and announced that while the council was discussing the rules of procedure, the monk he had brought with him would be placed in the palace dungeon, not as a criminal, but as a person whose testimony must be protected from pressure. A murmur ran through the hall. The abbot sent another letter in response. The monastery considered this an insult and a deprivation of spiritual protection. The prince signed the order. The monk was transferred to an underground cell, dry and bright, with a mattress and a table. The prince went there himself and sat down on a chair by the door. He watched as the monk placed his palms on the table and breathed calmly. He did not like it, but he knew that outside the walls of the dungeon, visits, conversations, threats, and promises would begin. On the second day after the hearing, a procession from the monastery approached the palace. The brothers walked in rows, carrying books and candles, reading prayers. A crowd gathered at the bars and began to argue. Some asked for the monk to be released, some shouted that 10 years of silence was a crime, and some reminded everyone that the apothecary's son had disappeared. The prince watched from the window. He summoned the captain of the guard and ordered him not to disperse the people or use batons. He wanted the city to see for itself where the habit of keeping one's mouth shut leads. By evening, the merchants arrived. They brought a delegation with arguments about the risks to trade. They said that any quarrel with the monastery would be taken by the market as a sign of instability. The prince listened and politely said that instability does not begin in trade, but in a room where a person disappears and a bag of silver is left in his place. 3 days later, the abbot sent a new letter. In it, he offered a compromise. The monk would acknowledge the violation of the charter in a private letter, and in response, the monastery would acknowledge the integrity of the prince's intentions and allocate funds for a school for townspeople, where they would be taught honest accounting. The monastery considered the young man from the transcription workshop to have been expelled at his own request, as stated, and the documents confirming this were unavailable for valid reasons. The prince understood that this was an old trick to replace responsibility with charity and then leave the previous order in force. He rejected the offer. He scheduled an open hearing and invited witnesses from that night. The old guard, the copyist who was working in the library at the time, and the apothecary, if he had returned to the city. The guard came, the copyist sent a letter, but the apothecary could not be found. Then the prince decided to use what he had: the monk and his own hands, with which he had once attached the letter to the gate. On the day of the hearing, he brought the monk out of the dungeon. He walked not as a defendant, but as a man waiting for a direct question. The prince turned him to face the courtroom and described what had happened between them 10 years ago. The glance, the slammed book, the letter to the judge, his father's order, the missing boy, the exile. The years of study, the cart, the illness, the hospital bed, the slow recovery. He spoke calmly. He did not demand confessions, did not use curses, did not press for pity. He only said that the entire system in which the monastery was allowed to be a state within a state produced disappearances and lies, and then bought silence with schools and scholarships. He proposed that the council make a decision to open the monastery archives, to repeal the secret decrees on transfers and punishments, to return jurisdiction over corporal punishment to the city, and to transfer the registration of monks to an independent official. The councillors exchanged glances. Each was thinking about his own affairs. Some recalled a relative in the monastery shop, some a loan from a merchant associated with the abbot, and some the guardianship of a granddaughter. Finally, one of them said that a decision of this magnitude was only possible with the consent of the majority of the provincial elders. This meant postponing everything for months. The prince realized that they needed a pause to arrange the usual bargaining. He turned to the hall and said that he would not back down. He signed a decree temporarily removing the abbot from the management of the monastery until the Council of Provinces made a decision and appointed a commission of city judges and learned clerics to inventory the archives. He knew in advance that there would be an uproar, but he could not delay any longer. At night, 2 brawls broke out near the palace. In one, craftsmen and students from the monastery school fought, and in the other, soldiers and people from merchant houses fought. By morning, the city had fallen asleep without peace. At noon, the chancellor came to the prince. He brought a letter from the lords of the northern provinces, who stated that interference in the affairs of the monastery would deprive the crown of future support in the war with its neighbors. The chancellor spoke of caution, of the need for compromise, of the delicate fabric of power. The prince listened and nodded. Then he took the chancellor aside and showed him a list of names from the city prison over the past few years. There were the names of boys caught for petty theft and women punished for violating trade regulations. He said that the state was firm enough when it came to protecting its currency, but too weak when it came to the truth. The chancellor realized that he could not be persuaded. On the 4th day after the decree, the door to the monk's cell was found broken. The monk was sitting on a chair, safe and sound. A bound soldier lay in front of the door. He said that a scream had distracted him during the night and he had lost consciousness. A piece of wax was found in the keyhole. The guards caught 2 teenagers at the bottom of the palace who confessed that they had been persuaded to do a good deed and open the way to freedom for the monk. They were linked to a shop that sold candles for monastery services. The prince realized that there was no point in looking for the puppet masters in the depths. He did not resort to pogroms. He ordered the guards to be doubled and the monk to be kept in prison for another week. He went out into the courtyard and saw the crowd. He raised his hand and said that he would not execute anyone, would not torture anyone, would not confiscate the brothers' property. He added that he would open the books and show the city what was hidden. The crowd listened without shouting. This silence was heavier than any shouting. Meanwhile, the commission entrusted with the inventory opened the monastery archives. At first, they were given unnumbered volumes with missing pages. Then one of the younger monks quietly handed them the key to the second room. In that room lay lists of transfers, instructions on the secret exile of students, instructions on payments to families on condition of silence. The papers were in order, the dates were in sequence, the signatures were neat. This order was more frightening than disorder. The commission brought the first folders to the palace. The prince spent the night at his desk. He saw how disappearances and punishments were recorded as non-staff transfers for spiritual reasons. He found sums paid to pharmacists, shoemakers, and copyists, and next to them notes of gratitude for wise silence. He was not surprised. He was stubbornly calm. In the morning, he signed a second decree to transfer cases of violence and forced transfers to the city court, and to leave the monastery's worship and schools under the supervision of independent trustees. The abbot sent a message in a harsh tone. He called the decree a blow to the faith. The prince did not respond in writing. He set a date for the abbot to appear in the hall and accept his dismissal. On the day of the meeting, the abbot came with his head held high. He was stubborn and calm. He said that he was not concerned with worldly threats and that he would leave if he saw it as God's will. The prince nodded and invited him to sit down. He did not tell him what he had learned. He did not chase him away. He only placed the inventory of the archive in front of him. The abbot silently ran his finger along the lines. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was no remorse in them. There was a simple calculation. He understood that he had lost, but he hoped for the swing of the provinces. The prince removed the seal of office from him and let him go. He left, without a scene. For the first time in many years, the city saw the monastery hand over its keys. There were no victory cries. Craftsmen walked by and looked at the gate without malice or enthusiasm. The young men from the school stood aside and talked among themselves. Some of them were afraid that they would lose their classes. The prince had agreed in advance with the teachers from the city schools and with the scholars from the university. Classes would continue, books would remain on their shelves, and no one would expel the brothers from their cells. He ordered that monks be considered citizens with the same rights and obligations as other residents. He understood that the form of clothing alone does not make a person better or worse. That evening he went down to the monk's cell. He told him that the abbot had been removed, the archives had been opened, the cases had been transferred to the court, and he himself was no longer a prisoner. He suggested that he come out into the light and live in the city, where he would not be touched. The monk stood up, but did not leave immediately. He looked at the table with a piece of bread on it, at the wall with a narrow window. He had grown accustomed to this silence. He asked where he should go now that the monastery was no longer his home. The prince said that the choice was now his own. He offered no advice. He stood by the door and waited for the monk to pick up his bag. The next morning they went out into the courtyard together. The guards stepped back. The sun lit up the stones. The city went about its usual business. Several advisors stood on the steps of the palace waiting for new orders. The prince stopped and looked at them. He felt tired, as if after a long journey. There was no regret in this tiredness. It was simple. He remembered how he had extinguished the candle in the library that night, and realized that he had come full circle, and returned to where he had started. Only now he was not standing alone at the book table, but standing next to the man he had once hated. Then he walked down the corridor, where orders were posted. The servant was nailing fresh sheets to the wall. about the inventory of archives, about the temporary administration of schools, about the protection of witnesses. People stopped the prince and bowed politely. He saw in their eyes not love or enthusiasm, but a calm habit of order. He understood that it was this habit that gave him a chance to consolidate what had been done. He walked past the door, where he had once waited to see his father, and never did. Now that door was open. He entered the office, where everything remained as before: a map on the wall, quills in a glass, a box of seals. He sat down and signed a few more papers for the court. A week later, the city court began its hearings. They proceeded quietly. Seated on the bench were people whose names were in the books signed by the abbot and the treasurer. The case was not about morals or immature desires, but about abuse of power, secret exiles, bribes, threats. The judges asked direct questions, and the witnesses answered briefly. Some nuns came themselves and talked about the transfers that were destroying their communities. Several merchants admitted that they had paid money for silence because they considered it a normal price to pay for peace of mind. The sentences were moderate: removal from office, return of funds, and a ban on holding management positions. No one was thrown into a pit. No one was flogged in the square. The prince watched this as if it were the cleansing of a lingering wound, without cries, but with an unpleasant truth. The young man from the transcription workshop was never found. Either there was a war in the colonies, or the head of the docks changed, and the papers were finally mixed up. The prince ordered his name to be recorded in the city book as missing. The apothecary did not return, and the shop passed to strangers. A new counter appeared in place of the old one, and none of the young customers knew who the old waits belonged to. This fact did not make it any easier, but it was honest, and it could not be replaced with a pretty word. The monastery continued to exist. Some brothers left for other houses where the rules were less strict, while others stayed and learned to adapt to the new system. The library stopped keeping candles after lights out, but the books still rustled when pages were turned. Young students sat at their desks again and learned to count, read, and bind books. They were taught not only the rules, but also that if the rules were broken, there would be a trial and order, not just a nod from the abbot. It seemed boring, but it was in this boredom that, for the first time in a long time, an honest foundation appeared. The prince did not seek glory for himself. Something else was important to him: that the city no longer live by a double standard, where one person could disappear without a trace, while another would be protected by the seal of authority. In the evenings, he would go out into the streets without his entourage, visit shops, and listen to conversations. Sometimes he heard his name and walked on without turning around. Sometimes it seemed to him that he had given up extra years of his life for this change, but he did not consider it possible otherwise. The monk rented a room near the market and settled down as a bookbinder. He was known as a meticulous craftsman. He worked slowly, but the book became strong under his hands. He did not return to his cell, did not look for a new community. He came to the temple on Sundays and stood at the back. His neighbors said little about him, and that was the best thing that could have happened. Once he brought a book with a new binding to the palace. It was an old chronicle of the kingdom. He put it on the table and said that in a book, as in life, It was important that the pages were held together honestly, without secret bindings. He said this quietly and without effect, and that was enough. The prince took the book and put it on the shelf. He did not ask the monk for an account of the past, nor did he give him instructions for the future. There was no friendship between them, as it is understood in novels, and there was no enmity. There was a recognition that each had made a choice, and that now both lived in a city that would no longer allow simple things to be hidden behind complicated words. The prince did not feel victorious. He only felt that the circle had been completed. He stopped at the door of the dungeon, where the smell of damp stone still lingered, and remembered the first night. He had said nothing then, and now there was no need for loud phrases either. He simply understood that he was no longer bound by the silence that had been imposed on him. When everything had settled down, talk of the coronation began in the capital. The court demanded a celebration, bright banners, music. The prince agreed for the sake of form. But on the day he was to be crowned, he rose earlier than usual and walked through the empty courtroom. On the table lay the papers of the cases that the judges had considered the day before. He ran his hand over the smooth surface of the table, and this movement became more important to him than the glitter of the crown. He knew that any celebration would end by evening, but the order of the papers in the court would remain. After the ceremony, he returned to the palace, and before taking off his cloak, went downstairs. There was the very dungeon. It was empty, clean, with the door open. He stood at the threshold and felt a simple feeling. In this emptiness, there was no threat, no mystery, no shame. There was only the air of the dungeon and the stone. He remembered how he had once failed to protect a boy and accepted it as a fact that could not be corrected now, but could not be repeated. He stepped out into the light and walked down the corridor. People were waiting for him in the great hall. He approached the table where the new seal of the kingdom lay and placed a thin knife for opening papers next to it. He thought that sometimes freedom is not a loud gesture, but a set of rules that you follow every day without deviation. He glanced toward the door through which the chancellor was supposed to enter with his congratulations. Guards stood nearby. He remembered the monk who now bound books at the market, and realized that in this city, everyone, even those who held the charter as a shield, had a chance to live without secrets. He quietly uttered a short phrase to himself, without witnesses, without pathos. It contained only the decision not to return to the old order. That phrase was enough to complete the long circle that had begun long ago in the library.